the central China coast. This involvement with the Taiping Rebellion is really quite fascinating, and we're all aware of the difficulty of this history. This is probably the bloodiest civil war in world history, with some historians believing maybe upwards of 50 million fatalities or more happened during this multi-year long social, political, economic, military rebellion. Many of the Taiping were Hakka, were Hokkien-speaking farmers and even sailors. And if you remember your history, of course, this was led by Heng Xiuquan, who saw himself as appointed as the Taiping Heavenly King, the kind of brother to the Christian Jesus Christ, and he fought the Tongzhi Emperor for control of central China. It is said that the Ningpo served in the fleets organized by Charles Gordon and the imperial forces alongside 4 small British steamers and a flotilla of 50 to 75 native craft, smaller native craft, in and around the canals of Nanjing, where the battles encompassed more than 1 million troops. So you can see how a vessel like this, for transporting troops, supplies, etc., would be pretty important in that kind of setting. Following the Taiping Rebellion, and beginning during the Opium Wars and afterwards, the Chinese Maritime Customs Service, or as it was known prior to 1911, the Imperial Maritime Customs Service, was run by the British. Since the British had forced open the treaty ports during the Opium Wars, they then kind of took control and assisted the imperial government in the tax duties, the revenues for foreign trade. But I've got to point out that did not include domestic trade or anything vessels like the Ningpo would have been doing. As you can see here, the quote from Sir Robert Hart, the Inspector General of the Customs Service, of native trade in the interior and the movement of native produce and foreign goods along the coast in Chinese junks, we know nothing. So, it's a real challenge for Western historians to understand this type of Chinese history. This Imperial Customs Service, of course, is what replaced the older Canton monopoly system that was in place that, forced all foreigners to only a very few places in China, only the factories in Canton. That was unacceptable to the British and other Western powers, and hence those wars were fought. The story continues then. The Ningpo is not out of trouble for long following that pretty tumultuous history. The vessel again comes to notice in the Hong Kong area, where the Royal Navy is protecting unsuspecting travelers in the region, particularly European travelers. It seems that the Ningpo sailors would entice foreigners on board with descriptions of fancy dinners and evening tours of a very beautiful island sprinkled area, and then rob them and set them ashore on remote islands and abandon them. And so, that type of thing was not going to be allowed to continue to occur. In fact, earlier on, another vessel, kind of a sister vessel to the Ningpo, the Guangzhou, was apparently engaged in the same thing and was captured by a British vessel, the HMS Challenger. So in 1884, the Ningpo was captured by the HMS Calliope, only to be recaptured by local Chinese pirates, so they say. She again comes to notice in 1911. We're not sure if she had a role in the Sino-Japanese War or Boxer Rebellion, but certainly by 1911, when the revolution in China is occurring, the modern revolution in China, the vessel Ningpo is captured by rebels in the Battle of Hankou. And, this is of note to us here in Hawaii, because Dr. Sun Yat-sen is, one of a revered figure here in our history, since he was here for a period attending school. But following that in 1911, finally to maybe just send this troublesome vessel away, the Chinese authorities allowed the junk to be sold to a group of American investors. And that group was led by a man named William M. Milne of Pasadena. And apparently he was an entrepreneur and associated perhaps with entertainment industry or Hollywood. I'm not clear on his biography, but she was purchased in 1912 for a total of $50,000, which in dollars today looks like $1.3 million, which is a rather significant outlay. The intention was to bring the vessel across the Pacific in order to make the Panama, California World Exposition in San Francisco in 1915, and then go onwards to other exhibitions and ports of call, and to continue to use the vessel to make money as an entertainment, as a museum of sorts. It was not an easy trip across the Pacific. It's kind of a two-part effort. The first part was a very stormy Pacific passage from China to Japan. And she was damaged in a couple of typhoons and some storms that followed, and ended up going aground and also being wrecked again and towed back to port. And you can see what we know of her first crew, led by ship's master Frank Skur, in that initial attempt, because the Catalina Island Museum now has the logbook of the voyage. They had some problems with people trying to board the vessel, and ultimately they left or were mutinied. That's not very clear. And the vessel was abandoned in Japan. So the second part of the Trans-Pacific voyage begins with a different crew under a German captain, Jens Toft, and a mostly German crew. And I would say plus most likely some Chinese sailors, although it's not unusual or unexpected that a European crew on a vessel purchased by Westerners might not even put on the logbooks or the rolls, a foreign crew that accompanied them, because there are pictures in the LA Maritime Museum of what we think are some members of her original crew. But anyway, they make a relatively quick passage over 58 days to San Pedro. And not easy, but there were several storms and some damage. The storm split the main boom and cracked the water casks and opened seams along the aging hull. That kind of thing happens. But they made landfall successfully. And it's said that they encountered a passing steamer some days out from their landfall, and the steamer offered to give them food. It was kind of noted in the news that the vessel was going to arrive. To which the Captain Toft, replied, skip the food, send us a keg of beer. And anyone who's been on a ship at sea probably says that's very likely that happened. That has the absolute ring of truth. Forget the food, give us the keg of beer. Now, finally on the West Coast, the Ningpo's career begins as a floating museum of exotic instruments and weaponry, purchased by Milne and others in East Asia. And between Long Beach and San Diego and Los Angeles, the vessel was well stocked with beheading swords, starvation cages, ancient cannon, pikes, spears, a beheading block, and even a makeshift dungeon down below. It seems that the effort was not really too successful, because she was eventually sold by Milne to the Meteor Boat Company of Los Angeles, continues to make appearances in that kind of commercial entertainment venue, and becomes a floating restaurant in Catalina, as well as a bar and nightclub. And also goes on the rocks during this time too, and is repaired in Long Beach, from which there are some interesting pictures. She was even a Ningpo cafe, a floating cafe, by 1914, which struggled to survive. It's not clear she was very successful at doing any of these pursuits. But by the passage of the 18th Amendment and ratification in 1919, which means prohibition, The speakeasy business, the cafe business literally dried up out from underneath the Ningpo, and she was left to settle in the mud on Catalina Island. And on the far side of Catalina Island is Ballast Point Harbor, and it's actually used or was used as a backdrop for a number of Hollywood movies in the 20s and 30s. Movies such as King of Kings and Old Ironsides and Treasure Island and Hurricane and Sadie Thompson and Mutiny on the Bounty. So I think if we look at some of those old movies, she might appear in one guise or another in the background for some of those, perhaps. Now, I want to say one thing about this kind of exhibition and bringing these types of vessels over to, be seen in these world West Coast exhibitions and going on elsewhere. Despite the focus on them and interest, they were almost wholly misunderstood by most observers in the West, and that's very unfortunate. Um, and I think the problem has roots kind of deep in Western philosophy and Western historiography. And if you look at philosophers like Friedrich Hegel or historians like Leopold von Ranke, there was a very 19th century, what we would say now, a very kind of racist, unfair depiction of non-Westerners and what they were capable of doing. These complex craft, well suited to their environment and indeed proven to be very old and still functioning, were seen as things not intentionally designed by anyone, but simply copied from nature in a kind of mimicked. And so there was a kind of very pejorative sense that, Chinese shipwrights didn't know that what they were doing and happened accidentally on designs like this. And so it's unfortunate that we misunderstood them as much as we did. But we have seen, or at least saw in the 19th century, certainly, non-Westerners as the other, as people to measure our Western progress by having something that was, seen as much less. The Ningpo was not the only vessel to cross and not the only vessel to be misinterpreted on the West Coast and elsewhere. Here you can see a whole list of crossings of the Pacific dating back to 1849, and some of those, vessels that arrived with migrants, with Chinese coming to the West, and many of them still staying, and they're descendants of the sailors that arrived on these junks in California and elsewhere. Anyway, you can see a number of vessels, the Wangpo, Ningpo here, Amoy, etc. Many of them brought over by entrepreneurs in the entertainment business, many of them not well interpreted and being lost later on elsewhere. I mentioned that, Milne brought the Ningpo over. This was not his first attempt to purchase a vessel and bring it across the Pacific. His first attempt was actually the Wang Ho, a war junk, a patrol craft, probably built in Shanghai, and attempted a Pacific passage in 1906, but was damaged and lost and probably abandoned in Australia. But you can see a rare picture of her here and the diagram done by G.R.G. Worcester, that river inspector that worked in the Customs Service. And this was not the only place it happened in the Pacific. As early as 1848, there was a very notable overseas voyage by the Chinese vessel Keying. And here is a drawing of her in London as kind of a floating oddity. And commenters at that time, despite, seeing the ship with all of its equipment, accoutrements, and crew, determined that if there would be any one thing in the world that it is not like at all, that thing is a ship of any kind. So narrow, so long, so grotesque, et cetera, et cetera. The commentary continued. Just a simple misunderstanding of the technical evolution and the achievement over hundreds and even thousands of years that is part of Chinese heritage, maritime heritage. Let's just remember to ourselves this point, the scale of this heritage that we're talking about. And I think it's only natural that us as humans, focus on, or we Westerners focus on, the Western maritime story, because It is rather remarkable that some very adventurous voyaging Portuguese in the early 15th century set out into the Atlantic on very small wooden caravels and eventually come to, include themselves in and dominate parts of world trade. That's part of the tale of the emergence of capitalism and the Western era of the Age of Discovery. But remember, all of that happens right within this range here. And if we're talking about Chinese maritime heritage and nautical technology and the evolution of that technology, we have to remind ourselves that elements of what is now called the Maritime Silk Road, the sea routes to the Indian Ocean and further west, here in green, were opened as early as the Han Dynasty. And so seafaring vessels of some technological capacity, getting better and better over time, developed over millennia in China. And of course, perhaps reaching their peak during the Ming Dynasty here with the celebrated voyages of Admiral Zheng He and the Ming Dynasty treasure fleets sailing along these same routes. Let's just remind ourselves how much of that scale, stands to still be understood in the light of the blue, white, red, or yellow, the Portuguese, Spanish, British, and Dutch trade routes, all trying to get to Asia, trying to get to East Asia, trying to reach what the empire had, the silks, the spices, the teas, the cargoes that everyone wanted. And since I mentioned the admiral, we really must have a picture of him, right? When you encounter statues of Admiral Zheng He, please do take a picture of him. He's quite famous. And this is an image of the Imperial Baochuan, the treasure galleons. Were they really 400 feet long? Perhaps, again, we don't have plans like that. We're not sure about that, but they were very, very large. Let's just put it that way. And there were fleets of them accompanied by a variety of smaller, specialized, special function vessels and huge armadas that dominated the global trade routes to the west from the Empire of China. The technology has, fascinated me for a while. And, even though a shipwright or a junk builder, might not remember how it all happened hundreds of years ago, what they're building is something that evolved over a long period of time that was ultimately a very complex and suitable and efficient and safe uh, transportation platform. And here you can see the multiple bulkheads that are as a standard feature in many of these traditional designs, the adjustable rudder that can slide up and down, dropping it lower for sailing at sea, bringing it up in the shallows, the heavy masts, probably ironwood masts, and the transom design in the bow. These are innovations, important innovations that existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and have been recognized internationally by the UNESCO Cultural Heritage Safeguarding List, being inscribed onto those lists as a cultural treasure, the knowledge of how to build these, inscribed in 2010 on that list. But not just the technology. I find the cultural features and the cultural aspects of the heritage and the vessels to be fascinating as well. And maybe this has something to do with my past as, growing up sailing with my dad on his sloop. But I've been in a few storms and I've hedged my bets and I've made some promises that I felt I needed to make at the time to get back to shore. And many people recognize this, that superstition is a quality that seems indigenous to the ocean, or few areas of the world are better suited to the preservation and creation of folklore than the sea. And so there are a number of these types of cultural features. Of course, the oculus, the junk's eyes here at the bow. For merchant junks, usually looking forward to see where the rocks are and the obstructions. For fishing vessels, probably looking downward to find the fish. But, many of these features that that I think are just really fascinating in the discussion of Chinese nautical technology and traditions. This is a picture of the Ningpo when she's on the rocks, went aground in San Pedro before going into Long Beach to dry dock. And here are those swallow boards on the side of the transom, and the swallow itself, the swiftlet. I guess which legend has, lived 6 months in underneath a shell in the ocean and then emerged from the ocean and always flew safely home. And so, returned from a stormy passage. And you can't quite make them out. It's a little bleached out here, but this board on the transom here would have images of the 8 immortals of the Tang Dynasty traveling overseas. A very standard type of ornamental decoration. And the snake, this is a very ornate one, but the Fujian snake, which had the powers to calm the waves. And you will see 3 characters here on the transom, Jin Tai Feng, and perhaps that is the name. There were a number of different characters throughout the vessel, sayings known as Cheng Yu, these kinds of inscriptions or sayings for good luck. But I guess we can interpret those characters on the steward as the name, Kin Tai Feng or Jin Tai Feng, on the renamed Ningpo by Charles Gordon. And this is all related to what is a very active recognition and practice of worship at the seafaring goddess temple, Matsu or Tianhou. No doubt the Ningpo had an altar on board to Matsu or Tianhou, or Tianfei as she is known, the Empress of Heaven. Of course, this is the Sung Dynasty historic figure, a daughter of a fisherman family who fell into a trance and dreamed of her brothers and father at sea, and they came back, and the practice of this local tradition, the folklore and local tradition, local religion of Tianhou, spread wide on the merchant routes on these commercial vessels, these Chinese vessels throughout Southeast Asia, and indeed internationally. There is a Tianhou temple down the street from us in Honolulu. I know there's one in Los Angeles as well. There's one in probably every major city. And in fact, another junk, a replica junk, the Princess Taiping, which was built and sailed across the Pacific and returned to China, and unfortunately was struck by a freighter about 27 miles off her final port, her final destination. Here they are in Honolulu, Nelson Liu, the skipper, and their altar to Matsu on board the Princess Taiping. So the practice of these Chinese junks, their operation, the heritage is closely related to what is still a very ongoing worldwide phenomenon of worship. I love this picture because I think that Worcester sums it up. These are very large, heavy, hardworking vessels, but not without their own grace and their own beauty. For ponderous dignity, the Fuzhou pole junks are unsurpassed. And this is another of those Forrest Wells photographs. You can see the steamer, the naval steamer in the background here in the picture. And certainly by the 20s when Worcester was writing, and certainly by the 20s when Wells was observing these vessels, they're vanishing very quickly. Worcester noted in his work that the vessels he saw of this style, the heavy pole junks, that were said to be 100, 150 years old already at that time. And so, there are none left. This is all gone away some 100 years ago already. It's very rare to see anything last that long, certainly still sailing. So that's really remarkable in the Ningpo story, that if she was built in 1753, she's still, afloat and touring in 1912, 1920. We do have a wooden ship in our collection in America, of course, that's about 200 years old, a little more. The USS Constitution in Boston Harbor. But the only reason that the Constitution, Old Ironsides, is still there is because she's about 10% original timbers. That that's a museum vessel, and it's worth the effort, but she's restored and rebuilt and kept afloat. Only 10% of her is estimated to be original. So to begin to wrap up then, what is the status now of what's left of the Ningpo? Well, as she settled into the mud, several things are said to have happened. Um, one, they said that, during the filming of some of those Hollywood movies, that they were making a real uh, a real pirate movie, maybe an Errol Flynn movie. They were using fire boats, fire vessels in the movie and set afloat, set ablaze, and sent downwind. The kind of thing that the was used against the Spanish Armada uh, back in the 16th century. The wind changed. One of those fireboats got out of control, ran into the old Ningpo over there, and burned her to the waterline. Perhaps that did happen. That's unfortunate. Also, the Boy Scouts during their jamborees were known to go over to the site and saw off some of the camphor wood and other hardwoods and make things like napkin holders to give away at international or national Boy Scout gatherings, which is also a little bit unfortunate, but those things happen. But there is still interest in the site, and here she is now at Ballast Point, and this is reportedly the location of her lower hull, which is sunk in the mud and covered with sediment. So what you see in the dark spots are probably growths around whatever part of that camphor wood or ironwood emerges, or is growth on top of that post that's sticking up, the rudder post, I would expect. And there are a number of people who are willing to volunteer and go over there and conduct an archaeological investigation. I understand there may be a small crab that's endemic to those mud flats, so there would be an issue with getting permission to. What we would need to do is use fire hoses and go out there on low tide and blast some of that mud off, study the lower construction of the hull, and then when high tide came back in, beat a hasty retreat back to shore. But I'm happy to say that I've been told there's a tavern about 200 yards away, so it's perfect for maritime archaeologists who are looking for a volunteer project that we might someday start on at Catalina Island. Mud is a preservative anaerobic environment, so that lower hull and the diagnostic features could be very interesting for us to look at. So this is my final slide, and that is the story of the Ningpo as we know it. I find it fascinating, the technical aspects, the cultural aspects, from a coastal lumber hauler to a rebel ship and smuggler to a floating museum to a speakeasy. The Ningpo has had an illustrious and long career, unusually long. She sailed out of history into the 20th century, a rare cultural record of China's maritime past that survived centuries of strife and turmoil to finally find a calm and peaceful harbor, what's left of her, at last. So thank you. That concludes my talk, and I'll be happy to end sharing the screen and turn it over to Linda for the next part.
Hello. Thank you, Hans. Oh my gosh, that was so incredibly informative. We have quite a few questions for you. So the
Uh-oh.
so the first question is from Irene, and she would like to know if any of the Wells photographs are published.
Not yet. I'm not sure how to do that yet, but I would really like to because they should be shared. Um, Wells not only had, boxes of photographs, but he had models, 42 models from the shipwrights in China that he collected. Those are all now at Texas A&M in their model laboratory and on display. And I'd like to take a selection of these photographs and publish them either online, probably best, or in a hard copy ultimately. But it's one of those side tasks that has to be done like on off-duty times, and I've got about 5 more years of work for the NOAA Sanctuaries program before I can really return to some of my favorite tasks.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Susan, and she would like to know what sources did you use to find the history of Ningpo?
Well, there's kind of a variety of secondary sources. Mostly, there were pamphlets that were issued by Milne, and there are documents, and there are newspaper articles. There are some written histories in books about, not only, well, about Catalina history and California maritime history. People have found this story and written summations of what they've been able to locate. Primary sources in China would be difficult, not only for me because I'm not fully, conversant in the language, but that the records of those times are very difficult to manage or handle themselves, as have been told by some of our colleagues at museums in Fujian province, the Overseas Communications Museum, or Macau Maritime Museum, etc. Be quite a task to try to look for primary documents. So secondary materials and just tidbits of them for the main part.
Okay. Munson would like to know if the Ningpo was ever a casino.
I believe so. I think that's mentioned. I wouldn't be surprised if in her, floating cafe, speakeasy, dinner palace days that there wasn't gambling going on. It's often a good way to get around regulations on land by putting your casino, legal or not, on the water offshore somewhere. But I don't have the details or can't, confirm that. I think it's been mentioned in some of the secondary sources written by some local historians in California and elsewhere.
Okay. All right. Jean wants to know, was the Ningpo fortified for battles, and how large a crew was needed? And yes, so that's the question.
hmm Well, to bring the vessel across, or, vessels like this, and Worcester is probably our best reference to understand the number of crew, 20 to 30. And typically these would be often family members, or village members from the same village operating this commercial um, type of platform. So 20 to 30 just to handle those big, heavy sails. For military operations, there are no gun ports. There could have been a variety of nasty things thrown over the side, as well as smaller cannon operated as. So I'd imagine even more people on board a fairly large vessel like this. Fortified, well, these pole junks were heavily built. Um, I imagine it's possible to fortify the bulwarks, the gunwale, and that may have occurred, but we don't know about that, if that did or not, or if this was a vessel to to transport troops and supplies, but let the steamers with the modern British cannon go to the front. I don't know. Good question.
Jean would also like to know, how fast could she cruise?
Oh, well, let's build one and find out. I think that's the only way we might know. Um, well, 58 days is respectable to cross the ocean on a large sailing vessel. She's not built for speed. This is a commercial carrier. So I would say not fast at all. I would be guessing 5, 6 knots, something like that, but it's just a guess. I was raised on fiberglass vessels, Gene. I don't have much experience in anything like this.
Okay, and our last question is, can you tell us the exact location on Catalina Island where the Ningpo is currently located?
Yes, of course it was Avalon Harbor during her commercial days, her F. Scott Fitzgerald period, so to speak. But Ballast Point is on the far side of the island, immediately adjacent to the isthmus. So where the island narrows towards is it the north end? You know, Linda? On the far side of the island, and that isthmus is Ballast Point.
Right.
So that's where she is. I'm sorry, I don't have a map of Catalina to point to, but and there are several other vessels that it was kind of a graveyard for old hulks. That happens quite a bit in areas near major harbors and cities. And there were others that were taken out there and kind of parked in the mud and left to deteriorate as well.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm going to now toss it to Jean for some closing comments.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this program. This is a really interesting topic, and it's nice, interesting to know that we have a relic, a 250-year-old relic, approximately, plus or minus, right here in California. So it's something that uh, is always learning. You know, we can educate ourselves. Uh, so anyway, I'd like to just extend my greetings to everyone in our audience. We're sorry we're still holding virtual programs and we can't see you face to face, but I'd like to share with you at least some of our upcoming initiatives or efforts. And but first, we'll start off. Rochelle, may I ask you to just move to the next slide? Okay, great. Recently, the Historical Society was uh, an attendee at the ribbon cutting for the Chinese Laundry building in Yosemite. This was on October 1st, exactly 60 days ago. And this was a success story in terms of a piece of our hidden history, our Chinese American history, being discovered, that it was being neglected. It was used as a storage shed, and but the Yosemite National Park's interpretive staff made a strong effort to return this building, not necessarily to its original use, but as an educational facility to share the role of the early Chinese in the mountains, in the Sierras, and also in Yosemite National Park, building roads, etc. So on October 1st, we witnessed, some of us, this was sort of a limited audience this time because we didn't really do much of a call, but we were able to get a few people, a couple of dozen people out there to see the grand opening of the Chinese Laundry building. It was accomplished with support from Franklin Yi and Sandra Wong Yi, who are shown here, and also with help from the Yosemite Conservancy. Next slide, please. May I have the next slide, please? And here's what the interior looks like at the moment in terms of the restoration of the building, the installation of interpretive exhibitions, and in the future, there will be more interactive exhibits. So that's something to look forward to. But this is a great example of the reclaiming of our history. A lot of our Chinese American history has been hidden. You know, maybe one day we'll hopefully we can get a chance to see the Ningpo as well. But the story of the Chinese Laundry building is a real success story, and it took 8 or 9 years of our continuous efforts in participating in the pilgrimages to Yosemite that we got the attention of the national parks folks, and were able to see this accomplished. So visitors, the many visitors to Yosemite will now be able to see a historic Chinese Laundry building. Next, please. But we're not going to stop at this. I know there are other efforts underway just recently in June, it was announced that the summit tunnels, which were dug by Chinese workers for the first transcontinental railroad going over the Donner Pass route, are now recognized as among America's 11 most endangered places. The summit tunnels have been abandoned for quite some time, but they're still owned by the Union Pacific Railroad. And there's an effort being mounted by folks from the Asian Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, API-AHIP, to get the summit tunnels and the associated Chinese camps recognized as historic sites, and also to make them available for accessible for the public to visit. Next, please. More recently, in the San Bernardino Inland Bulletin, a newspaper, there was an article about the forgotten Chinatowns of the Inland Empire, and the fact that the China House or Chinatown House in Rancho Cucamonga is the last remaining structure out of all of the Inland Empire Chinatowns. We were actually successful. When I say we, I meant it was a joint community effort. The Chinese Historical Society, Chinese American Museum, API-AHIP, Chinese American Citizens Alliance, and also the Historical Preservation Association of Rancho Cucamonga were successful in preventing the demolition of the Chinatown House. However, it still requires a preservation plan. And because of this recent article, we've begun organizing a group to start planning and start working toward a preservation plan for this 1920 building. It doesn't look like much. It's a unreinforced masonry building, but it also housed 2 Chinese businesses, and the upstairs were a dormitory for the Chinese workers in the Cucamonga area. So we hope we can save the last remaining structure out of all of the Inland Empire Chinatowns. Next, please. So our efforts at historic preservation are really a part of the ongoing efforts for recognizing our long history in California and the West. The Historical Society has monthly programs that are free. We have a newsletter. We try to keep everybody informed through our website. Thanks to Ricky and Ricky Leo in helping revise our website. Linda Benz has been working with a pretty good sized crew of interns in organizing our archives. We still have our historic houses on Bernard Street that we're in the process of doing some renovation to make them more accessible to the public. And we will get some paint, by the way, on those buildings. I know people have wondered, but that's part of the overall plan. We will start up tours hopefully when COVID eases, but also historic preservation is one of our important initiatives, as I mentioned in the last 2 slides. So we really have a long-term goal of really recognizing our Chinese American history, our important Chinese American history. So we hope you can join us by becoming a member, by by supporting us with your year-end donations. It's December. It's the time for renewing our memberships. Angela Lancaster, our membership secretary, I really we should have had her here, but I know you're in the audience there, Angela. Hi, and but we do want to invite you to continue invite you to continue looking for our monthly programs, read our newsletters, go to our website. We really try to share as much content as we can with you. There's a lot to learn. And as we have seen tonight, there's always these very interesting aspects of our history, our Chinese American history, that are really worth exploring further. And it's also worthwhile looking into efforts to try and preserve some of this heritage. So thank you very much to everyone on behalf of President Susan Dixon and our board. We thank you all for supporting us throughout the whole year. This has been a very good year for us. The fact that we could not have our April fundraising dinner resulted actually in many people stepping up and generously providing donations to keep us going. We have been able to support the efforts of our interns. We don't have staff, but we do have many interns led by Susan and by Linda, and we hope that we can continue this effort into the new year. This being December 1st and our last appearance before you for 2021, we hope you all have a happy holidays. We all hope you have a great new year, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you. Good night.